Hi, my name is Kirk Hamilton, your host of the Staying Healthy Today show. This is a show where we bring you key experts in the fields of nutrition, prevention, integrative, and lifestyle medicine. And we have topics for the individual and sometimes for society in the whole. And today's show topic is Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting, the Chinese Communist Party's intentional genocide of Falun Gong practitioners, and probably other face, an interview with Dr. Jessica Russo. Dr. Russo is a psychologist, a mental health advisor, and she's part of Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting, which is a group that has been committed to, first of all, finding out about what sounds like it is a horrendous practice, forced organ harvesting, and bringing it to light from the early 2000s up to 2000, I think 16 or 17. There was a China tribunal, which really brought it to the forefront. Even moving forward today, we've had congressional and Senate laws that have been passed in the House, and they're in the Senate right now. So against forced organ harvesting. So, Dr. Russo, thanks for coming on the show today. Um, look forward to talking to you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure. This is a subject that is very serious and dire, and so many people don't know about it or they have misinformation. So I'm so glad to be able to talk to your audience about it.
So, tell me a little bit about your professional background, and then how did Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting cross your path, or the issue of forced organ harvesting? Did that come first before the doctors group?
Yep. Okay. So I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm based out of Philadelphia and I'm in private practice. And I mostly specialize in trauma. I'm certified in integrative mental health as well as EMDR. And I'm registered with the National Register of Health Psychologists. I did my training in Illinois. Well, I did my master's in Georgia, did training in Illinois, and then came to Philadelphia to do my postdoc. And actually, is then when I started learning about Falun Dafa, this practice, there was a fifth generation acupuncturist who was doing his psychiatry residency while I was doing my residency in psychology. So he taught me the practice. He showed me the exercises. I did some of the readings, and I really discovered that this is an incredible practice that's very healing and has helped millions of people with all sorts of things, mental health conditions as well as physical issues, from cancer to colds. It's incredibly curative. And then a few years later, let's see, we're talking about 2006 now, the allegations of forced organ harvesting came to light. And this was also at the same time where a major research endeavor was taken into looking into forced organ harvesting. And that's when this all came out. And that's actually when Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting formed. I wasn't a part of it then. In 2013, I was asked to come on. They wanted someone who was familiar with mental health to talk about
Mhm.
that angle. This is really actually considered, forced organ harvesting is considered a genocide. So we really wanted to take a deeper look at that issue and the psychological impact of that, how that could happen, how that is happening, how they're enacting genocide, not just in China, but they're carrying forth their propaganda and all sorts of things throughout the world to make sure that they can continue with this mass murder through organ harvesting. So that's how it all started. And our organization actually was the first to coin the term forced organ harvesting. People were not talking about this at this point. They were talking about black market organ trade, but this is very different. So what's happening in China is the only government in the world that is harvesting organs from its own citizens, making a profit, but also we believe the primary impetus for this is to eliminate what they feel is a threatened group. So they've been doing this on mass scale since about 2000, and this is shortly after the persecution of Falun Gong began.
There was up to, I think, 100 million people practicing
Yes,
Falun Gong,
that's
or
right.
75, 100 million people. And then
Yes.
the crackdown, and the government actually supported it for initially. When I think I'll
Yeah.
say his name, Hongji, Long, Mr. Hongji. I said his name wrong, but he started it in 1992, I believe.
Yes,
He came
exactly.
and brought and
Yes.
it's a kind of a mix of because I've seen it and I've tried a little bit Buddhist tradition with a little Tai Chi, Qigong type mix in the exercises.
Mhm.
And so I see these big pictures when I look back of masses of people sometimes wearing yellow in the parks and the things like that practicing
Yeah.
and to me they remind me of the most Gandhi-like people in the world. I mean, truthfully, it's a rehash of what I was 40 years ago or interested in 40 years ago. And they're an amazing group of people, truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance. I was born in Hong Kong, so it kind of
Oh, how?
the whole China thing and communist China and I was born in Hong Kong, lived there 3 years. My dad was a Pan American pilot, but I remember that
Mm,
Hong Kong. This is how I got into looking at this. Hong Kong, was this free enterprise capitalistic place, and then what happened is, it got Great Britain gave it back, and there was
mm,
this 50-year plan
yeah.
to give it back, and communist China said we'll have two systems, meaning allowing them to be capitalistic but one country.
Yeah.
And then about halfway through that, the the Hong Kong movement started a pro democracy movement, and then China stepped in and clamped down on national security law from communist China. And then I think a couple of years later, in 2024, it happened by the local government. So I just
Mm,
watched that freedom getting squelched, and I was listening to China in Focus at the time. It was
mhm,
on YouTube, and I didn't have any idea that Epic Times and that's where I saw your interview with next
right.
to Jan Jekielek.
Mhm.
And I didn't have any idea. I just got very interested in it. And so that's how I got connected and I saw the Shenyang signs up and I wanted to go see the dance troops. I had no idea that most of them are Falun Gong practitioners and most of them can't go home and they're persecuted here in the United States.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of like this full circle of events. And then the forced organ harvesting thing was like, just can't ignore it, and these people being put away and they get blood work done on them. I'm a medical person and, they get blood work done on, so these prisoners get blood work done on them. You ask why? Well, they're collecting data so they can
Exactly.
be immediate use, so to speak, of for their organs.
Yeah.
And then, the question, I'm rambling in a sense, but I'm trying to put it together in a picture is like, we paid for this
Mm,
in a way. I mean, who trains these people? Who trains, when the Chinese surgeons and the Chinese doctors and come over
yeah.
here to train,
Yeah.
or even the medical supplies or whatever? It's so interconnected. I don't think people realize how in indirectly responsible we are.
Absolutely. Yeah, Kirk, you bring up so many important points. I want to just step back actually, because a lot of the people listening to this may not be familiar with Falun Gong. So I want to talk a little bit about that and how the persecution started.
Hmm? Sure.
So Falun Gong, as you say, you're absolutely right. It was introduced to the public in 1992 by Mr. Li Hongzhi. Before that, it had been passed down from one disciple to the next. It's a very ancient practice. It's considered an ancient form of Chinese tradition. So it involves meditation, slow moving exercises, but the most important component is assimilating into truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance. As a side effect, you get very healthy. And so this practice, as you noted, attracted many people. This was shortly after the Cultural Revolution, where people were really craving a return to traditional Chinese culture and the kinds of rituals and practices that existed before Mao. And so this was part of that. And so people were really drawn to this. They found it incredibly powerful. And the government, in fact, was saving so much money on healthcare because there were about 1 in 10 or 1 in 12 people practicing. 70 to 100 million people, according to the Chinese government's own estimates. And this was in 1998 when they determined the number. So that's about a third of the US. That's the whole East Coast. That's a huge number. But the then head of the Chinese Communist Party, Jiang Zemin, said, you know what? This isn't a formal practice. We can't keep track of it. This is way too popular. And the fact is, the values are antithetical to communism, right? Any authoritarian regime. It's truthfulness, compassion, forbearance. That's just the opposite of what the Communist Party was practicing. So there was really, from their perspective, no room for a practice like this. So they heavily started cracking down. Jiang Zemin said this is going to be eliminated within 3 months. Well, it wasn't. It spread to over 100 countries, and it's practiced freely in most countries. In Russia, there's actually some pushback. As you know, this is a very restrained government as well. Not as bad as China, but it's pretty bad. So one of the worst forms of persecution, of course, is forced organ harvesting. And we see the numbers shoot up after the start of the persecution, which was July 20th, 1999. Within a few months, we see that the transplantation system had just skyrocketed. They only had about 150 transplant centers in China throughout the nation. And then after the persecution, all of a sudden they have 600. And they can't account for the increase in numbers. They say, well, we've been using executed prisoners. They never talked about using prisoners of conscience, living people. But they said, we've been using executed prisoners. In fact, the former Minister of Health in China, Huang Jiefu, who is now the head of the so-called donation system in China, he had said many years into this, when people were getting very concerned about prisoners being used, because that is already very unethical, he said, well, 95% of our organs do come from prisoners. But the fact is, according to Amnesty, and it's a state secret how many people are killed within the prison system in China, but they had said the number is going down. So they were thinking it's not going to be more than 2,000 a year. The donation system still is almost non-existent. They had no formal system until 2013. So that can't account for the huge number. And what the number that they said they were doing back in the mid-2000s was about 10,000 per year. And so I mentioned this research study that was looking into this, and this was back in 2006. And they took the number at face value. They didn't question that, but they just wanted to find out who is the organ source. And they found 34 pieces of evidence. And one of them was this boom in the transplant industry. All of a sudden, they were only doing a few transplants every year. Now they were doing hundreds, if not thousands. So they determined for sure this is Falun Gong practitioners. And then they even had undercover people calling up, pretending they were family members. They would call up the transplant centers, the hospitals, and say, I'm looking for an organ for my relative. I understand you have Falun Gong there. They would be talking to the doctors in many cases. Doctors would admit this, because remember, this was before this all came out, right? The study hadn't come out yet, so there was no exposure of this. So they freely said, yes, this is our primary source. So come quickly. We have fresh organs, very healthy. So that was another piece. And also, you can get an appointment to get an organ in China, like a heart. So if you can go to China in 2 weeks to get an organ on a set day, someone's going to be killed, right? You can't live without a vital organ. So there were all these pieces of information that told them, okay, this is not donated. Then in 2016, this was a really important study done by the same people, plus one other. So this was conducted by 2 Canadians, David Matus, a human rights lawyer in Canada, and a former Secretary of State of the Asia Pacific region, David Kilgore. They did the study in 2006. And then in 2016, they joined forces with an independent journalist, Ethan Gutman. And Ethan Gutman had found very similar numbers and similar evidence as to what was happening with organ transplantation. So they said, this time we're going to look at the actual number that they're doing of transplants. And then we're going to start from the beginning. We're going to look at organ source. They got the same confirmation, same information about who the organ source is, primarily Falun Gong practitioners. But this time, they saw it wasn't just 10,000 transplants they're doing a year. It was between 60 and 100,000 per year. Huge number. The US had always led in transplant. We've historically done the most. But Kirk, we only do about 45,000 per year. And that's at the high end. So now China has surpassed us, and it's not being done ethically, right? And you're right, we are complicit because we are working with them. We are training Chinese surgeons who will likely go back and commit these murders because we know the donation rate is next to nothing. A few years ago, it was determined that the donation rate was about 0.03%, which is only just over maybe 300,000 people. Of course, it doesn't account for that. So we're training Chinese physicians. We have pharmaceutical companies in the West, and they're primarily in the US, that are providing materials for China's transplants. And then we have medical supply companies also providing products for China's transplant. So we are very much involved, and it's been very tricky, very difficult to get the transplant community in the West to come forward and acknowledge what's happening. Our organization has been blocked many times from being at the transplant conferences, the American Transplant Congress, the World Transplant Congress. I could tell you more about that, but I know I've been talking for a while now.
No, I wanted to have you get that out. I mean, it's the perfect, it's the perfect evil in the sense that if you wanted to get rid of a group and make money at the same time,
yes,
and what people don't realize is that Falun Gong practitioners tend to be more healthy. So they're a better place to get organs from. So,
yeah.
from just a terrible point of view, you're making money off getting rid of your political threat because freedom is a threat to the Communist Party.
Absolutely.
So you're getting rid of your threat at the same time as you're making money, and you're getting your number one adversary, the United States, involved indirectly, and and so to admit a wrongdoing on our part is incredibly difficult. So the process might continue. So I talk to patients sometimes, and I'll say, you can go get an organ in 2 weeks, a heart. And I've read about South Korea, I think, has a hospital there that is just for South Koreans. So not only is it horrendous to think about, when I say live organ harvesting, patients look at me like I'm, live, like, no anesthesia, just it's just mind-boggling. But you can think of this. I wonder if, another fear would be that people allow this to go on with other countries, and because this is medical tourism at its maximum. And when Xi Jinping was with Putin just recently, we were sharing that he let out immortality or living to 150.
Right.
Now, personally, I don't think that would backfire on them, but I don't want to see that tried, but that's when you talk about another country and you're talking about the two, some of the most powerful leaders in the world. That's a really scary thing. And I always think about, because I've been following unrestricted warfare of communist China for years and how it's invading the United States from multiple angles. This is just one of them.
Yeah.
All the data they collect on Americans, from gene testing to whatever, you wonder if they're making some massive pool. I know that gets more far out there, but Falun Gong practitioners, getting back to it, are the perfect group to do. They're a nonviolent group, but what's Gandhi-like, or whatever you want to call it, it's the group is continuing to grow among the persecution.
Yes.
And they continue to spread the word somehow. To me, they're some of the most courageous people in the world.
Absolutely.
I sit here, so you can speak to that, that.
Yep. They never fight back. when they're persecuted, they're horribly tortured. And by the way, that was another piece of evidence. They're horribly tortured, and yet they're being subject to these mysterious medical exams, right? They obviously don't care about their health. So you're right, this is a very brave group. And this also speaks to the impetus for this genocide. So initially, it seems to have been an ideological motivation, right? These guys think differently than us. It's a huge group. We can't keep track of them. Let's squash them. Let's annihilate them completely so we don't have that threat. But now it seems to be a threat to the very survival. It's an existential threat to the CCP, because what Falun Gong practitioners have done, speaking of bravery, they've created their own media companies, and they're telling the world about China's crimes from the very beginning, right? So you mentioned the Epoch Times. That has become incredibly popular now. They're letting people know not only what the communist government has done to Falun Gong, but to their own people in so many ways, to the Uyghurs, to the Tibetans, the Hong Kongers, what they did during COVID, shutting down domestic travel, but allowing international travel. They knew what they were doing. They wanted this to spread. And the Epoch Times was one of the first to report on this. They also started the first or the largest grassroots movement called Tweedong, which literally means to quit the party. They have helped over 450 million people quit the Chinese Communist Party through their education. What government has done that, right? So it's incredibly powerful. Because you're right, when you talk about their power and the impact of the Communist Party on the West and on the US, it's really dangerous, because we're talking about an infiltrated, insidious one of values that don't match our own. And that hot mic conversation really captures that. For those of you who in the audience, and probably everybody has heard about this by now, but the conversation was about organ transplants. And Putin was saying organs can be continuously transplanted, and she is suggesting that there's word out now that you can live to be 150 years old, maybe even achieve immortality. So the way they're talking, well, clearly, I think it's an admission of forced organ harvesting, because how can you continuously transplant organs? Where are you getting these organs from? We all know in an ethical system, it's very hard to get an organ. In the US, where there are 145 million people waiting to donate their organs, you still have to wait months, years, and sometimes you never get an organ, right? Because you have to wait for somebody to die. It has to be the right match. But here they are talking as if this is an endless supply. And just a few days after this came out last week, the Chinese government shut this down from their state media. And I don't think they would have done that if they were talking about animals, for example. They're talking about pig organs now, transplanting pig organs into humans. They could have just talked about that. But no, I think it's very clear. So when you hear them talk so nonchalantly about human life and human dignity, and you know that they are leading now in transplant, that's a very scary thing. And it's not just about transplant. They're finding a way into so many institutions in the US, into our educational institutions, into our governments, even at the local level. I mean, they are really infiltrating. And Kirk, I want to mention this because this is really important. In 2022, it actually came out that Xi Jinping, the head of the Chinese Communist Party, he had instructed people in the party to crack down on Falun Gong in a way they haven't before, not in the West, right? So he had said, we're losing the battle on Falun Gong, and we have to work harder. We have to use the media in the West to make sure they are carrying forth this negative messaging, so people are no longer sympathetic to the group. And this is how genocide works, right? You have to get the will of the populace, otherwise you can't carry forth your agenda. And this is what we've been seeing over this last year. Many negative articles in the mainstream media as well as social media. You mentioned Shen Yun, talking badly about Shen Yun, creating all of these lies and distortions, and Falun Gong itself, the training ground. Shenyun has a training ground in New York. They're really saying some very awful things, and people are believing what they're saying. We're seeing this now. People are turning away from Falun Gong. Shenyun shows have been canceled throughout the world. So it's a really dangerous thing. And again, the transplant community is helping China cover up its lies. And we keep getting blocked. But what we'll do is we'll have a table outside the convention to let people know about what's happening. And a lot of them do know, but they don't want to know. I had someone come up to the table at the American Transplant Congress we had outside, and this was in Philadelphia last year. And we had all the information, all the academic journals that gave the evidence that this is still happening. And he said, this isn't happening. And I said, we have everything here. It's all free. Please take it. He said, I don't want to. And I said, well, then you can't say it's not happening. He said, you're right. So they know that they don't want to know. There was somebody a few years ago, he testified in Congress. He's in transplant. And he had said, well, China is now acting ethically. They're really turning things around. And a question arose, well, how can you claim this? There's no evidence to that. He said, well, I'm not the one who needs to be claiming this. This is what our governments need to be figuring out. But he just said it. So there's a lot of contradiction, and it has to come down to wanting to make money and maintain the status quo. But we're really hurting ourselves, and we have been, especially since we let them into the World Trade Organization in 2001. I mean, we're really putting ourselves in such a precarious position.
Yeah, no, I mean, we're speaking the same language. When you can have Chinese police stations in major cities across the United States, that say they're there to support their people, but really they're trying to find people who are dissidents, so to speak, and take them back to China, and God knows what happens. So I am with you. I am with you. So let's wrap this up. Tell people, like, I'm going to put in underneath this, I'm going to put in it's HR. I don't whip the names out, but there's the two Congress, and just had it here. So HR, the Stop Forced Organ Harvesting Act was passed in May of 2025 in the House, and then now there's the Falun Gong Protection Act.
Yes.
In the House it's 1540, and in the Senate it's 1870, and they're trying to get it passed there.
Yeah.
And then at least I don't know what that'll do, except I'm not sure what that will do. But what would you suggest people do to continually be involved? I mean, I have people encourage them to go to Epic Times. I encourage them to go see Shenyun. I try and connect it to health. And that's why I'm putting it in this podcast. And truthfully, maybe this sounds crude or too simplistic, but we're shooting ourselves in the foot. We're shooting ourselves in the heart. Let me put it that way.
Yes.
Literally, if we don't deal with this.
Absolutely.
If that government ever gets control of the vast majority of the world and parts of our country, it could happen to us.
Yes. Yeah.
And I don't think people realize it, but I can see it.
Yes. You're right. It's so insidious. A lot of people don't realize it. It's so subtle. This is what we call psychological warfare, right? This is not the typical war you see on the battlefield, but we are at war. They declared war years ago against the US. So it's up to us to wake up and say, okay, we're not going to follow this. So you're right. One of the best things people can do is call their elected representatives, senators, and ask them to co-sponsor these bills. There are actually 3 bills now. One is still in the House. And I should have the numbers here, and I don't. That hasn't gotten much traction yet. And then there's Chris Smith's bill that you mentioned, the Stop Forced Organ Harvesting Act. Mm-hmm. So that's in the Senate and the House. The Falun Gong Protection Act as well, that's in the House and the Senate. This will help not only Falun Gong practitioners, but will help anybody else who's being subject to forced organ harvesting. We can see now that the Uyghurs are now being subject to this, and they have been at least since 2017, maybe even going back to 2014. And this is all because we didn't stop the Chinese Communist Party years ago when they were heavily persecuting Falun Gong. And that persecution, of course, hasn't stopped either. Falun Gong is still the primary group, which is why this bill is so important. And again, I think this is a group worth protecting because they have done so much to help educate all of us and draw people away from communism into believing that human rights and democratic values are the most important thing, right, for a flourishing society.
The term that China, it's called unrestricted warfare, and there's two colonels who wrote a book on it. You can go buy it off Amazon. Well, the reverse would be the Falun Gong practitioners laying down their lives. I mean, I don't know how else to say it. I mean, they're the most courageous people.
Yeah.
But them doing that is actually protecting us, or at least,
Yes.
Whether you believe in that tradition or not is not really relevant in the sense that these are people that are living a path that is threatening the Communist Party,
Yeah.
and just because and they're doing it in a way that it's amazing they keep growing. And keep making an effect, and they keep getting killed for it. It's so anyway. So how do people I'll put the URL for Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting. That's a good place to go to get
Yeah.
videos and things like that.
Yeah.
I'll put in the different Senate and House bills underneath our interview. But what else would you tell people to do?
I would say to go to faluninfo.net. This is a site that has all the information you want about Falun Dafa, what it is, the persecution. This is a great site, great information on this psychological warfare that's going on and what the media is doing. And those are probably the main ones, the Epic Times, that one, and then they can go to our site, dafo.org.
Yeah, I have all those already written underneath.
Yeah,
I
great.
started work on the project. The video is one thing, but resources for them.
Oh, there's also an online petition they can go to, and I think that's FGPA, the Falun Gong Protection Act. It might be .org, but I can get you that link, and so people can go there and they can just sign it very quickly, and that'll go right to their senators.
Great. No, please email that to me, and when I post this, we'll do that. Anything else you want to say?
No, I'm just so glad that you get this, and I've been able to talk to your audience about this, and I just hope everybody can be aware and contact their senators and their representatives about this.
Well, thank you for being so articulate too, because sometimes I get so much information. I didn't want to spit it out in a way that was just too much, but you kind of funneled it down. So thank you so much for doing that. And I want to thank you, the audience, for listening to this edition of the Staying Healthy Today show. And until next time, stay and be well.